Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of 6 sessions in our webinar series on how to enable enterprise digital transformation. My name is Chris Parry of the HCI Group, and I am delighted to introduce our series lead to everybody, Mr. Ed Marx. Ed has served as a CIO at some of the nation's largest health systems and is now dedicating his time to help his fellow IT leaders on their digital journeys. Recognized as a leader in his field by HIMSS and Chime, and both by CIO World and Computer World and many others, Ed is the author of 3 books, including the 2019 healthcare bestseller, Voices of Innovation. Ed has a new book on healthcare digital transformation. It's coming out later this year and is also contracted for a 2-book series in 2021. So with that said, Ed, welcome. Thank you so much for bringing us all together today to talk about digital transformation. Ed, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I'm really excited to share with everyone a little bit about the knowledge that I've learned along the journey of digital transformation. And the intent of the series, as Chris was sharing, is I want to take what I've learned and some of the research that's available to us and what other industries have done and really help equip others with concepts and tools to develop comprehensive strategies for their own organizations. I know when I started formally in this sort of role about 3 years ago, there was really nothing out there, especially in healthcare, but generally no playbooks out there that we could use. You could read a book from an academic or you could talk to a consultant, but none of them had actually ever done digital transformation. They just spoke to the theory, which is important and very helpful, but there was no one out there that had actually done it. So I'm really happy to share this with all of my colleagues. I'm still learning too. I think this is just a natural evolution as we learn more about digital transformation. No one has all the answers, but if I can offer you 1 or 2 things each time that we meet, I'll feel like we have really moved the ball forward. So this is basic today. We're talking about digital defined. So before you think, wait, this is too basic, I'm telling you, and I'll share stories to make the point, that if you don't get this what seems simple definition correct for your organization, everything else will be on shaky ground, if you will, as you move forward. And again, the intent of the series, just to say it one more time, is each time we meet, share a little bit more with you about what you might be doing. So this first time we talk about digital defined, so you have a month. Go figure that out with your colleagues, with your peers, you know, what that means for your particular organization. And then we'll move on successively. In the third part of this series, we'll actually share with you a construct for digital transformation, an end-to-end construct. And I'm really excited to share that with you. It's not the end-all be-all. It's something that you might want to consider it like a wireframe, and you might make adjustments. You'll probably make it better, which is great. So, but it'll give you a construct that you can work from that's been tried and tested and successful. So let's just start into this and talk about how we transform digitally. I want to just point out that there's ability to have question and answer. So the way we're going to do this is we'll speak for about 15, 20 minutes max, then we'll go to everyone's questions. So please use the question functionality on the GoToWebinar, and then we'll wrap up with some action steps. So as we begin, I want to introduce my co-presenter today. My special guest is Patty. And Patty and I have worked together or been colleagues for, I want to say, 20 years. So Patty, as you can read here about his background, has an incredible experience, but he was the key person who helped me when I was at the Cleveland Clinic developing the digital strategy. I needed someone to come alongside of me who understood digital transformation and was very well organized and could help me construct a strategy. And so Patty was very, very instrumental in doing this. He's also an author. So with that, I want to introduce Patty. So good morning, Patty. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ed. It's a real privilege to be on this webinar.
Okay, so what we're really talking about today is what is digital transformation. And so let's just start with that. Patty, I'm going to start with you. What do you think about digital transformation? Is it something new in our ecosystem, or has it been around a while? What are your thoughts?
So I'm going to take a slightly different track than defining it in terms of technology that most people would expect. So I'm going to say digital is like democracy. And let me pause for a second to let that sink in. What do I mean by this? So let's start with democracy. If you ask anyone to define democracy, you're going to get a different definition depending on who you're talking to and depending on which country they're from. So I was born and raised in India, which is the largest democracy in the world, and I now live in the United States, which has had a democratic form of government for a long time. But if you really ask someone to define democracy, you're going to have a hard time getting a consistent definition. For instance, in India, as well as in the United States, you have a representational form of government, and you have elections every few years. In India, you have them every 5 years. In the United States, you have them every 4 years. In India, you do not elect the prime minister directly, but in the United States, you do elect the president directly. Those are the differences. Right? But if you look at the similarities, it's representational government. Every citizen has a vote, and everyone gets an opportunity to participate in the elections. So when I look at digital, if I look at all the definitions that I see from different firms, I find that there's a lot of surface level differences in the definition, but if you look underneath, there's a lot of common themes. And we will unpack some of that when we discuss the rest of the content in the webinar, but you will hear terms like data, analytics, experiences, cloud computing, human-centered design, voice recognition, a lot of other emerging technologies. But essentially, they all are means to describe this phenomenon or this concept called digital and digital transformation. So I would say, you have to develop your own definition of digital at the end of the day, just like every democratic country has developed its own definition of democracy.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And I take sort of a contrarian viewpoint as well, but I'll share with you how I've reconciled it for myself. I view digital transformation as nothing more than the natural evolution of technology in the human experience. So when I really thought deeply about this, I recall when my first daughter was born in 1994, and I won't go into the details because of time, but the point is that we had some technology, we applied it in a very innovative way, and we ended up saving her life. And it was through technology and a transformative use of it, new in the medical field. It was just brilliant that the individuals involved thought about this, but it saved my daughter's life. And I realized then, that was sort of my defining moment, how I got into healthcare IT. But I realized then that that's transformation. I think, if I advance 10 years to my time as CIO at university hospitals, where I inherited a conglomeration of a variety of PBX systems, and I didn't want to rip them all out and replace them with a new PBX. So I looked out there, what was out there. VoIP was emerging. Every industry used VoIP except for healthcare, and so we were the first in the world to go all VoIP in healthcare, and we brought together voice, video, and data, and really revolutionized the way that we communicated within the health system. Now today, everyone does it. But back then it was pretty new, and I could give you all sorts of examples. So digital transformation to me is nothing new, but here's how I reconcile it. And I think this is really important. No matter what you think about it, and like the examples you were giving, Patty, related to democracy, if it helps energize and focus organizations to make improvements, I am 100% supportive and rally. I've adopted that term, and I rally around the term because everyone sort of understands that we need to continue to evolve. And if it's digital transformation is the big buzzword, I was working out this morning and watching some news programs, and I heard digital transformation mentioned in commercials. I heard it in the text of the news program. So it's all over the place. So the really smart CIO, the really smart person, leader, really just lays hold of it, owns the term, and then moves forward. So with that, let's try to put some definitions around it. Now, Patty, I know that you spent extensive time doing research. I've been traveling the country talking to CIOs. Tell us about, and you've done focus groups. Tell us a little bit about some of the research that you've done, and if you could summarize this slide briefly, and then we'll move forward on our own ideas on defining it.
Right. If you look at this chart, and then, I'm not going to read through all the definitions here, but the main point that we want to make with this slide is that every organization has its own definition of digital. Just like I pointed out that every country has its own definition of democracy. None of them is wrong, and they're all right. The organization that is defining it the way they want to define it. So one thing to note is that when you talk to an organization, or when you look at an organization defining digital in a certain way, you have to be aware that they're defining it in the way that is in alignment with their own business model and what they're trying to sell or provide as a service in the marketplace. So that's the main point of this slide, but you'll still see a lot of common themes. Everyone talks about reimagining the business, about artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, the experience design and all that. We did some research, my firm did some research back in the summer of 2019, and we found that the maturity levels of organizations, based on the maturity levels that we saw, we classify the organizations into 4 different models. At one end, you have the entities that are essentially looking at their electronic health record systems, and they're extracting or leveraging whatever features and functionalities are available in the EHR system as their primary driver of digital transformation. And I would say if you looked at the vast landscape of hospitals and health systems in the country, about half of them fall in this category. At the other extreme, on the other end, if you will, are the big health systems of the country, the Cleveland Clinics, the Mayo Clinics, the Intermountains, Kaiser, Partners, and so on, that are looking at digital transformation in a holistic, enterprise-wide fashion. They're taking a step back. They're looking at what they need to do to reimagine their own businesses, what kind of technology platform choices they need to make, what kind of strategic partnerships they need to enter into, and they look at it in a very holistic way. And you have a couple models in between where you have one model where you focus on a particular capability like telehealth and then go all in on it. And in another model, you set up a digital function where the group does a lot of standalone kind of projects, but they're not necessarily integrated into an overall digital strategy. So those are the 4 different models that we see at.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So we're going to go ahead and put out our own definitions for everyone. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but you need to define it. And I'm going to share a story in a second here about how important that is. So as much as you might be thinking right now, this is really basic. Again, it is the foundation for everything that you go forward with. And I'm going to give you a test. If you believe it's basic and everyone in the organization understands it, I'm going to give you a test that you can do to really basically test your own theory. So this is how we define it. So as Chris mentioned in the beginning, Patty and I are co-authoring a book that's slated to come out in May or June of this year called Healthcare Digital Transformation, an Agile Method to Accelerate and the Adoption of Digital. So we came up with this. It's digital transformation is a reimagining of the business through a combination of technology, data, people, and process. And again, it's not very new to what we've been doing all along, right? As experts and leaders in IT, all of us here on this webinar. So I try to simplify it a little bit. I think the focus is shifted now to experience. So I say improved experiences powered by technology, enabled by design. And one of the things that we'll talk more about in the second and third sessions, as we give you the entire construct that I mentioned, and architecture for digital transformation, is the whole concept. There's some new concepts. One will be agile, and another differentiator is culture. Something else not talked about much, but really the icing on the cake, if you will, is design. So we really need to bring more human-centered, human factor design in our digital transformation capabilities and strategies, as well as physical design. So some new concepts that I'm really excited to share with you to give you a really robust and more mature, when Patty was describing the different levels of maturity, a more mature sort of construct. So, and you already heard Patty talk about this, digital is like democracy. So whatever it is, it's really important to define it. So let me give you a quick story to bring home this point. And this is something, again, I'm trying to be practical. This is something that you can test in your own organization, and I would challenge you to do so. So I thought that, and I'm not going to name organizations because all of them are great organizations that I've been privileged to be part of, but I was in one organization where I thought we had a lot of clarity, and we sort of came together and formed as a team that this is the direction we're headed, and these are our specific priorities. So as a test, we had each member of the executive staff, so there's 10 of the executive team. We gave out 3x5 cards and basically share with us your top three, what are the top three initiatives we're going to do for this digital transformation. So we had defined digital, and then we said, hey, give us your top three. Now, I was hopeful that when I took all of these 3x5 cards and counted them, that we might have a variation of maybe up to 8, maybe 10. So out of 10 people, there's a possibility of 30 different answers. I was hoping at this point we would have 8, like I said, on the outside, maybe 10. So as we started compiling all these, we had over 20. So it made me realize that we needed to double down back on the definition so that everyone really understood and sort of bought into where we're headed. Now, some of the reasons for this we're going to talk about on our next webinar in terms of how do you get everyone not just to commit sort of verbally, but also culturally, so that you're moving in one direction and being really effective with use of your resources. So again, the point made now 3 times is definition may seem basic, but it's foundational to success. Just like this picture of the only house standing after a horrendous hurricane in Texas back in 2008. The reason that this house stood and all the others fell, it was the only house that was built to specifications. A lot of people took shortcuts. They thought, oh, we don't need to use that quality of wood or that size of wood or that type of nail. We can take some shortcuts and save money. So when the storm came, there's only one house left standing. And again, it wasn't a superstructure. They just did everything to code. And that's what we're saying. Take the time. Do this right. It may seem simple. You might get a lot of head nods, but test it. After you think you've got digital defined, test it. Do that simple experiment I just described. And you'll be hopefully pleasantly surprised that everyone is on board going the same direction. Or you may find that what probably happens in the majority of organizations, people still are interpreting things in their own view and not necessarily as an entire organization. So with that, I think we will, well, let's talk about one more thing, Patty, and then we'll move on to questions. So we talked about current state already in terms of the different levels of maturity. Let's talk briefly about new market entrants. So this is, when I say new market entrants, I'm really talking about 2. One is the tech giants. So AWS, Google, Microsoft, every large technology firm is dealing with the same issue, and that is they've had tremendous year over year growth, right? Several of them are valued over $1 trillion today. So when they look at how do I continue to grow, it's only natural that they look at healthcare, which is 18% and growing of GDP. So they are coming into the market big time. And then the second is retail, and that's the Walgreens, the CVS, and those sort of things. So Patty, I'm squeezing us for time here. Can you give us sort of like a 1 minute on the tech giants, and then we'll switch over to retail? What are your thoughts about that in terms of digital?
Yeah, I think the retail, the big retail giants, you mentioned Walgreens, Walmart, CVS, obviously, now that they've merged with Aetna. These are entities that are making significant commitments to growing their healthcare businesses. In fact, I'll give you one example. Walgreens, they have launched this Find Care application, which is essentially a digital front door, which competes with the patient applications that have been launched by many of the health systems. So essentially, they're going after the primary care experience and they're signing up partnerships with digital health startups as well as traditional healthcare companies, and they're trying to convert the footfall in their stores into digital relationships. This is just one example of how we're going to see the markets getting reshaped by the emerging players who could come from one of the existing traditional retail chains, such as a Walgreens. There's many other examples like that that are emerging, which are very, very significant for the future of traditional health systems.
And what are your thoughts on sort of big tech, other than what I shared already in terms of why they're focusing on healthcare? What should we be aware of?
I think as far as big tech is concerned, what we're seeing, what our research is showing is that not all tech firms want to get into the business of healthcare themselves, but there's a couple that may eventually get into the business of healthcare. So we're looking at, Amazon, for instance, that's already formed this joint venture with JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway, which is Haven Health. And then, we've seen them make some very pointed acquisitions, such as PillPack and so on. So that's an example of a tech firm that could be getting directly into the business of healthcare services. But for the most part, if you look at the Googles and Microsofts or the Salesforces of the world, they don't seem to want to get into the business of healthcare. So you really need to watch. And, Apple, for instance, we don't know where they're going to land. But I think these are all companies that need to, be watched very closely, because they have almost infinite resources, and they could conceivably get into the business of healthcare if they wanted to, in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think that as we talk more about strategy in the next webinar, Patty, we'll keep talking about big tech and retail, because this is an excellent opportunity as people develop their strategies, as organizations develop their strategies, to partner. I just find it hard to believe that we'll be successful on our own. So I always believe it's great to leverage partnerships, and so we're seeing some of that already. We won't go down that direction on today's webinar, but that's something to start thinking about, is whose values align with your organization's values? Who do you feel confident, and start partnering? It might be joint ventures. You might start commoditization of various capabilities of your organization, working with partners in the tech giant space or in the retail space. So we have about 7 minutes left. So let's start talking about some of the questions. So the first question is, and I'll go ahead and take the answer on this, Patty, and then we can go to another one. How long does the digital transformation process take? So developing your strategy, how long does that take? So it's obviously going to differ for every organization. I think, my experience has been, and Patty, again, you were a great help in this. If you use Agile, you can move this along pretty quickly. So we developed a strategy that included hundreds and hundreds of individuals in the organization having input. We had really good structure. We had really good milestones. And we actually developed the strategy in 3 two-week iterations. But if you were to include all the other, preparatory type work and, doing all the subsequent presentations, you can create an effective digital strategy, I believe, in a matter of months, like 3 to 6 months. I wouldn't spend more time than that. I think that just means you probably have too much bureaucracy. So I think you could really structure it to be in 3 to 6 months and come up with a really good, solid plan. And hopefully this series of webinars that we'll be doing over the next several months will really be helpful to you, because I'll share with you everything, very, very transparent, share everything with you in terms of what others are doing in the industry and what has worked for my organizations in the past. And so it'll be really, really practical. So Patty, the next question is sort of similar, and maybe you can give a stab at this one. And so you defined digital, as we've talked about in the last 20 minutes. Now, what's sort of the next step? What do you think would be the next step in this process?
I think organizations can make a really good start by looking at what's already going on in the enterprise. And we've seen that with many large health systems, digital is already being practiced at maybe a departmental or a functional level, by way of innovative projects that have been launched and rolled out. And so one place to start is to see what is working well, and then try to roll it out across the enterprise. A telehealth or a virtual care model of any kind. So if you've got like telepsychiatry, telestroke, why not look at teledermatology and tele something else? So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is look at what your peer groups are doing, and wherever they're focusing, maybe an indication of where you should be focusing. An example of that would be digital front doors, like patient apps, which are very, very important today. They're almost becoming table stakes for participating in the digital health landscape of the future. So those are just two examples. I think there's, to your point, that you don't need to spend a year trying to figure out, how to line up all the ducks in a row. And that's the whole, it goes to the heart of how to go about it in an agile manner. You have to do, you have to pursue multiple strategies, multiple threads, and, they will all proceed in a different pace, but you don't have to do it in a linear, single-threaded kind of way.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and thanks for bringing that up. So you're right. A lot of times you see these big announcements, and I know our audience is comprised of small hospitals and larger health systems and everything in between, and as well as individuals and organizations from the ambulatory space. Don't think that you have to make an announcement of a 3 to 5 year, $300 million investment, and because that, to me, when I see that, I just wonder how long it's taken them to get there and their linear approach. So while it may seem chaotic, it really isn't if you adopt that agile format, and we'll talk a lot about that as well in upcoming episodes, but you can start doing things right away. So it's, define the digital, and then you can start doing things as you more formalize your strategy, because you'll know things already. It'll be pretty intuitive what you need to do. So the point is, start working on this. Do not wait, because that takes, depending on your organization, could take over a year to come up with this master plan of hundreds of millions of dollars in many, many years. And that, to me, is just, that's not digital transformation in my mind. So we have several more questions, trying to get to all of them. Patty, I'm going to throw this one at you as well. Be mindful, we have 3 minutes and we want to get at least one more question in. Talk about people believe that given what's happening with Google and Nightingale and the investigations taking place, it's put a pause perhaps on and made a sort of a watch and wait approach. Can you help us overcome with some guidance on how you think about creating cloud-based data insight platforms for transformation that puts patient privacy first? So basically, how do we make sure we do this in the right way, mindful of all the regulations and putting patient security first?
Yeah, I'm reminded of an old proverb: how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time, right? I would say, there isn't a clear path and an answer to it. These are very complex questions because of the fact that, there's so much politics and policy and, activism and so on rolled into all this. So I'm going to be very careful about not wading into that. But I think, cloud service providers, by and large, have demonstrated that they have very secure environments. They know how to handle data in the cloud. It's a question of making sure that you sign the right kind of agreements with them and make sure you're doing your due diligence and putting in safeguards. I'm actually working with one of my clients right now where we're going through this exact process, and we be very specific with the questions you want answered, and ask the questions when you have your negotiations with your cloud service provider, and you make sure you have the safeguards in place, and you'll be okay. You throw those over the wall. You just have to make sure you do your due diligence.
So there's a lot more questions. We only have time for one more. I'll take this one, and that is, how important is it to include the voice of the patient in digital strategy design? Absolutely critical. I've always incorporated patients into my committees that I've had or task forces and ensure that their voice is heard. So it's very, very important. Doing focus groups is also important. Sometimes it's better to aggregate the voice of the customer and bring it to the strategy team. Depends on the maturity of your organization. Sometimes if you have a patient there, people will maybe give too much weight to one opinion over the other. So I think focus groups is another really good way. I do both. It's critical because, again, we talked about early on that the construct that we'll be sharing with you includes design. So both the physical design and the human-centered design. So how can you not include a patient? So absolutely, it's all about the patient, you know, and part of digital strategy, though, realize is your community, it's your business, it's your caregivers. So you include all of them in those particular pieces. So really critical. Great questions. I wish we had time to answer them all. We'll try and catch some of these at the 5 p.m. session, which is also live. I want to thank you, Patty, for joining me. Fabulous. Thank you for all your contributions for everyone in terms of digital transformation and your sharing via books and podcasts and CIO Magazine. And thank you everyone for taking 30 minutes out of their day. Would love to have feedback. You can see my contact information right there, and feel free to contact me if you have ideas. I'm learning as well, so it's a two-way street. Thank you so much and have a super, super day.
Thank you, Ed. It was a real privilege and honor to be on the show.